I found out my parents had given our family metal workshop to my sister's husband, so I quit slaving away 80 hours a week for free. A week later, my dad rang me in a panic, saying, "Our biggest client's about to leave." I answered coolly, "That's the new owner's problem now." Complete story with all updates. Can you imagine dedicating your entire life, your very soul, to a family legacy, pouring every ounce of your being into building something real, only to discover one day it was all just a cruel, elaborate lie? That everything you bled and sacrificed for was secretly signed away to someone who couldn't even tell steel from aluminum? I found out the hard way. And let me tell you, when my father called in a panic a week later, practically begging me to save the family business, I had only one calm, quiet answer for him: let the new owner deal with it. My name is Olivia Hart, and I'm 32 years old, living here in Green Bay, Wisconsin. For the past 10 years, 10 grueling years, I poured myself into my family's metal shop. 80-hour weeks, sometimes more. No paycheck, no insurance. Just that unwavering promise: one day, Olivia, this will all be yours. This was the legacy my grandfather built with his bare hands, and every single burn, every deep scar, every sleepless night spent hunched over those roaring CNC machines, it all felt worth it. I believed I was earning my future. I believed them. Then, one cold Friday night, the truth ripped through that belief like a jagged piece of metal. I was sorting through quality control files, tired, my hands grimy with cutting oil. Tucked away, almost hidden, I found it, a sealed folder, marked "Confidential." My heart hammered as I tore it open. Inside were legal transfer documents. Full ownership of the shop, given to my sister's husband, Chad. A man who, and I am not exaggerating, barely knew the difference between steel and aluminum. I remember standing there, the buzzing fluorescent lights overhead, the smell of coolant thick in the air, staring at those papers. 10 years. 10 years of my life, my sweat, my dreams, signed away. Just like that. It was over. I quit the very next morning. No notice. No fanfare. Just gone. A week later, my phone rang. It was my father. His voice trembled, a sound I'd never heard from him before. "Olivia," he pleaded, "our biggest client, Steelcore Dynamics, they're about to leave. Please, we need you back." I took a slow, deliberate breath. And for the first time in my life, I felt truly calm, truly powerful. "Let the new owner," I told him, "handle it." I grew up in the hum of machines and the metallic smell of cutting oil, in a world that never really slept. The industrial zone near the bay was a maze of concrete, sparks, and men in stained coveralls yelling over the roar of compressors. I was the only woman who worked there full-time. The only one who could change a carbide insert faster than most of the guys could even finish their morning coffee. They used to stare when I first arrived, half curious, half doubtful, as if waiting for the moment I'd give up and find a more suitable job. But I didn't. I stayed. I thrived. I learned every sound those machines made. Every subtle vibration through the concrete floor. Every faint smell that told me something was off. This shop, this incredible place, had been in our family for 3 generations. My grandfather built it back in 1970 with just one battered CNC mill and a dream that smelled like steel and sweat. He started out making tractor parts for local farms, sleeping on a cot in the corner during his first winters because he couldn't afford to heat the place. When I was little, he'd let me sit on his knee and press that big, green, cycle start button. I can still remember the thrill, the absolute magic, when the spindle came to life. The way the metal screamed softly as it cut, like the heartbeat of something alive. When he passed away, my father took over. He wasn't a dreamer like Grandpa. He was practical, cautious, the kind of man who measured worth in hours worked and numbers earned. But he loved the business, and I wanted to make him proud. After high school, while my sister Claire went off to study marketing and chase internships in Chicago, I enrolled at a technical institute. I wanted to learn to program those machines, to design jigs and fixtures, to make metal behave exactly the way I wanted it to. When I graduated, I came straight back to the shop, thinking I'd earned my place the old-fashioned way, by showing up earlier and staying later than everyone else. And I did. When I joined, we had 6 mills and 3 lathes. Within a decade, we grew to 10 mills and 5 lathes. We took on contracts with medical device manufacturers and aerospace suppliers. I ran the machines. I designed the custom fixtures. I handled quality control and negotiated directly with clients whenever a drawing came in with impossible tolerances. If a part had to be within 3 microns, it was my responsibility. If a customer sent an emergency job on a Friday night, I was the one who stayed until dawn to finish it. The work was hard. The machines ran hot and loud. I can still smell the mixture of coolant and oil that clung to my clothes, even after washing. My hands were permanently rough from deburring sharp edges. My nails trimmed short because long nails didn't survive in this trade. I learned to read the machines by ear. A faint chatter meant a dull tool, a deeper hum meant the spindle load was too high. When the others couldn't figure out why a part was off, I'd stand beside the mill, listen for 10 seconds, and know exactly which offset to tweak. They called it intuition. I called it obsession. There were nights I'd look at the clock and realize it was 2 o'clock in the morning, the whole industrial park dark, except for the glow of our shop's sodium lights. Sometimes I'd take a break, sit on the loading dock, and watch the fog rise from the bay. My reflection stared back from the oily puddles on the concrete, and I'd think, this is my life. This is the price of building something that lasts. Clients started asking for me by name. Engineers from larger firms sent their blueprints directly to Olivia at Heart Metal Works. One even joked, if she's on the job, we can stop worrying about the specs. Every compliment made the long hours feel lighter. And every time my father said, "You're the future of this place, kiddo," I believed him. He said it so often that it became a promise carved into my chest. I never asked for a paycheck. My parents said the money was being reinvested, that I was building equity in the company. They provided a room upstairs, dinner at the family house, and told me that was enough for now. One day, "This will all be yours, Olivia," my mother would whisper, touching my shoulder as I came home, covered in grime. And I smiled because I believed her. I didn't need contracts or titles or paperwork. I had trust. I had family. And I had my hands, the same hands that once fit inside my grandfather's gloves, now calloused and steady, shaping metal the way he taught me. For 10 years, I gave that shop everything I had. Every hour, every ounce of energy, every part of me that could still move after the sun went down. 80 hours a week, sometimes more. The machines didn't stop, and neither did I. I woke up before dawn, my alarm blaring at 4:30 a.m., and the first thing I did was stretch my back, which had started aching before I even turned 30. By 5, I was already at the shop, the lights flickering on one by one, the cold air thick with the smell of metal dust. I would prep the CNC mills, load programs, calibrate offsets, and by the time anyone else showed up, the first run was already complete. No one ever asked me why I worked so hard, because everyone already knew the answer. Or, at least, they thought they did. "You're doing it for yourself," my father would say with that tone of patient authority, like he was handing me wisdom. "You're building your own future. Remember, Olivia, this is all for you." My mother would nod beside him, a soft smile on her face. "One day, sweetheart, when it's yours, you'll be grateful you stuck it out." So, I believed them. I believed that the long nights, the skipped dinners, the birthdays spent at the shop were all part of some greater plan that would one day make sense. The truth is, I didn't have a life outside those walls. My friends stopped inviting me out years ago after hearing, "I can't make it," too many times. I missed weddings, holidays, even my sister's baby shower. When I wasn't at the shop, I was asleep. And when I wasn't asleep, I was thinking about the shop. I ate standing up most days, usually cold leftovers balanced on a tool cart between machine cycles. My hands were cracked from coolant and metal dust. My hair, once long and shiny, was constantly singed from welding sparks, uneven where it had burned off near the ends. I had scars on my forearms from hot shavings and tiny burns that never healed quite right. My nails were split and gray from the oil, but I wore them like medals. There were days my body begged for rest. My lower back throbbed like a warning light I never turned off. I would lean against a workbench for a moment, stretch until I felt the vertebrae pop, and then go back to loading stock. I told myself pain was proof I was earning something. When exhaustion blurred my vision, I reminded myself, "You're the future of this place." That was the phrase my father used the most. And every time he said it, it felt like a promise I couldn't afford to break. Vacations weren't part of my vocabulary. When the crew took time off, I covered their shifts. "The business can't run without you," Dad said once, half joking. I smiled, not realizing it was truer than he meant. When I finally took one weekend to visit an old college friend, I came back to find 2 jobs behind schedule and a mess of broken tool paths. My father shook his head. "See what happens when you're gone." From then on, I never left again. I told myself it was loyalty. Deep down, it was fear. Fear that if I wasn't there, they'd find a way to prove I wasn't needed. Love was another casualty. I tried dating once, a civil engineer named Mark, I met through a supplier. He was kind, patient, and fascinated by what I did. But after a few months of canceled dinners and rescheduled weekends, he stopped calling. I didn't blame him. I couldn't even promise him a Friday night without my phone buzzing with an urgent call from the shop. Once, I remember standing outside by the loading dock, phone pressed to my ear, the night air cutting through my jacket while I tried to explain to him why I couldn't come over. "You always say you're almost done," he said quietly. "But you never are." He was right. I never was. The shop became both my cage and my cathedral. Every time I heard the steady hum of the machines, it felt like purpose. Every time I wiped sweat from my forehead and looked at the finished parts gleaming under the lights, it felt like pride. And when my parents walked through the door smiling at the efficiency reports, it felt like approval, the kind of approval I had spent my entire life chasing. I thought if I worked hard enough, if I became indispensable, they would see me not just as a daughter, but as an equal. There were small moments, though, when doubt crept in. Like when my father handed my sister a check for helping with marketing, even though she hadn't stepped foot in the shop for years. Or when my mother casually said, "You know, Chad might take the business to another level once he gets more involved." My stomach tightened, though I didn't yet understand why. I pushed the feelings down. Family was family, I told myself. Don't compare. At night, when I finally lay in bed, my body sore and hands still smelling faintly of aluminum, I'd stare at the ceiling and imagine the future they kept promising, my name on the sign outside, my team working under me, maybe even a small office with windows. It was enough to make the fatigue bearable. I told myself that people like me didn't need recognition right away. I believed that merit, like gravity, would eventually pull things into balance. But it never did. Looking back now, I think my biggest mistake wasn't working too hard. It was believing that fairness would just happen on its own. That love and loyalty would naturally lead to justice. I thought if I became the best, if I carried every burden, if I proved myself beyond question, they would have no choice but to give me what I'd earned. I was wrong. In a family business, merit doesn't always win. Sometimes it's silenced. Sometimes it's quietly replaced. And sometimes you don't realize you've been erased until it's already too late. It was around 2020 when Chad Walker entered my life, or rather, invaded it. He came in wearing pressed shirts, polished shoes, and that practiced confidence of someone who's read more business books than he's lived real days in a factory. My sister Claire brought him home for dinner one evening, her voice practically glowing as she introduced him. Chad just finished his MBA at Northwestern. He's brilliant, Olivia. You'll love how his mind works. Brilliant. That word lingered in the air like a bad perfume. It was the same word people used when they didn't have evidence of actual skill. I shook his hand that night across the dinner table. His grip was too firm, his smile too white. "So, you're the engineer," he said, like I was some novelty item he'd just discovered. "That's impressive. Women in manufacturing, that's rare." I forced a smile. I'd heard that line before, just not in such a patronizing tone. A few months later, my parents announced that Chad would be joining the family business to help modernize operations. Supposedly, he was there to digitize processes, build the brand, and develop new partnerships. The truth? He spent his first week walking around with his phone, taking photos of machines he didn't understand, posting them on the company Instagram with captions like, "Innovation never sleeps," or, "Another successful day at Heart Metal Works." The comments were mostly bots, but my parents were ecstatic. "Look at the engagement," my mom said, eyes shining. "He's bringing us into the modern age." Meanwhile, I was crawling under a CNC lathe that had just jammed, covered in oil and metal dust. I remember looking at him across the shop, me in heavy gloves, sweat pouring down my neck, him sipping a $10 latte, scrolling on his tablet. And realizing how differently the same word, work, could look. Chad's schedule was generous. He'd show up around 10:30, sometimes 11, with a Starbucks cup in one hand and his Bluetooth headset in the other. "Just had a call with a potential partner," he'd say, even though his screen showed nothing but ESPN scores. He'd stay for a few hours, disappear for a lunch meeting, and return around 3, usually in time to make one more post or chat with suppliers I'd already handled. By 4:30, he was gone. And yet, unlike me, Chad got paid $60,000 a year, my mother proudly told me, as if she were announcing my promotion. "He's bringing real business expertise," she said. "We can't expect him to volunteer like you do." I stared at her, stunned. I'd worked 10 years without a single paycheck. 10 years of grinding, bleeding, missing holidays, and now they were cutting checks for a man who didn't even know what G-code was. When Chad got his company truck, a brand new Ford F-150 with custom detailing, I didn't even pretend to smile. "He needs reliable transportation for client visits," Dad said, handing him the keys. "You still have your old pickup, right?" I looked out the window at my rusted, 20-year-old Chevy with its cracked windshield and oil stains on the driveway. I didn't answer at first. I told myself it didn't matter. I was the engineer. He was just the figurehead. Let him play dress up. Let him stand in front of the machines for photos and pretend he knew what torque limits were. The clients knew who actually got the job done. I convinced myself the work would speak for itself. But slowly, I started to see something shift. During meetings, my parents began turning to him first. "Chad, what do you think of this?" "Chad, maybe you could handle the client presentation?" I'd sit across the table, covered in small cuts and bruises from the shop, watching as he talked in circles. Words like scalability, efficiency matrix, digital footprint, and they'd nod like he was speaking gospel. Sometimes he'd glance at me mid-sentence, just long enough to flash that polite, empty smile that said, "You stay in your lane." One evening, we were closing up the shop. I'd just finished a 14-hour day fine-tuning a titanium mold that had to be shipped out the next morning. Chad was standing near the front office talking to Claire. I overheard her laugh, a sound that felt condescending. "En's the technical one," she said. "But Chad's the strategist. That's what keeps the business alive." That line cut deeper than any metal shard ever had. "You're the technician. He's the strategist." As if execution was meaningless. As if years of sweat and scars were somehow less valuable than PowerPoint slides and buzzwords. It wasn't just favoritism anymore. It was rewriting history in real time, turning my labor into his legacy. I'd see posts online, "Under Chad's leadership, Heart Metal Works enters a new era of innovation." My designs, my builds, my clients, all stamped with his name. My father would beam with pride every time someone mentioned Chad at a networking event. He's got vision, he'd say. Finally, someone who understands both sides of the business. Meanwhile, I was still sleeping in the same childhood room above the garage, still driving a pickup that rattled every time I shifted gears, still waiting for the acknowledgement that never came. I told myself to ignore it, to keep working, to let the numbers, the output, the quality speak for me. But deep down, a quiet fear had started to grow. Because I'd seen this pattern before, just not in my family. I'd seen it in trade school, in every factory, in every meeting where I was the only woman at the table. The talkers rise while the workers fade into the background. For months, I bit my tongue, smiled through the injustice, and told myself I was being paranoid. But every day Chad stayed longer in the office. Every meeting he led. Every decision my parents deferred to him made one truth sink deeper into my bones: I was being replaced. Not by someone better, but by someone who looked the part. And I realized that my biggest threat wasn't incompetence. It was charm. Chad didn't need to outwork me. He just needed to outtalk me. And in a family where words carried more weight than sweat, I was already losing. It happened on one of those nights that blended into all the others, past midnight, the rest of the city asleep, the shop humming softly like a living thing. I was alone, as usual, reviewing the quality control files for a titanium order that was due in the morning. The parts gleamed under the harsh fluorescent lights, perfect to the last micron, their surfaces cold and sharp. I remember rubbing the back of my neck, my muscles tight, the faint scent of coolant and ozone hanging in the air. My hands were blackened with grease and ink from the paperwork, my brain on autopilot after 14 straight hours. All I wanted was to finish the job and go home. I pulled open the filing cabinet to double-check the purchase orders, but one folder slipped free and hit the floor. When I bent down to pick it up, I noticed a red envelope, half hidden behind a stack of old binders. The bold, stamped letters across it read, "Confidential." It wasn't mine, and I had never seen it before. Something about the way it was tucked away made my stomach tighten. I wiped my hands on a rag, sat down at the desk, and hesitated for just a second before sliding my finger under the seal. Inside were legal documents. Pages of formal text and signatures that didn't make sense at first. The words, "transfer of ownership," were printed at the top, clean and final. I kept reading, my eyes moving faster as understanding began to dawn. The new owner of Heart Metal Works was Chad Walker. Not my father. Not my mother. Not me. My name didn't appear anywhere except once, buried in an appendix labeled, "Employee List." The transfer had been signed, notarized, and dated 4 months earlier. My father's signature. My mother's. The ink looked fresh enough to still smell faintly of toner. My throat went dry. My chest tightened as if the air had thickened around me. I flipped through the pages again and again, hoping I had missed something. Maybe a clause, an addendum, a single line that included me. There was nothing. The hum of the machines in the background seemed to fade, replaced by the deafening sound of my own heartbeat in my ears. For years, I had believed I was working towards something bigger than myself, that all the hours and sacrifices were bricks in a foundation I'd one day inherit. And now, on cheap white paper, I was being erased from that story entirely. I stared down at my hands, oil-stained, scarred, the fingertips rough from a decade of metal and heat. These were the hands that had built this place. Every machine, every fixture, every custom jig had passed through them. And yet somehow, they didn't count. My parents had chosen a man who couldn't tell a drill bit from a reamer over their own daughter. They had traded experience for image. Sweat for charm. Substance for show. The anger came fast, raw and hot. I slammed the folder shut, the echo sharp against the metal walls. But beneath the anger was something worse, a deep, aching grief. Not for the loss of the business, but for the devastating realization that the people I trusted most had never really seen me. I had spent a decade proving myself, and it still wasn't enough. I sat there for a long time, staring at the flickering light above the desk, replaying every conversation, "You're the future of this place," that suddenly felt like a lie. When the clock on the wall hit 3 o'clock in the morning, I made my decision. I was done. I pulled out a piece of company letterhead and began to write, the pen shaking in my hand. To the management of Heart Metal Works, effective immediately, I resign from my position. Good luck running this place without me. I signed it simply, Olivia Hart. When I set the pen down, a strange calm settled over me. The kind that comes right after a wound stops bleeding, when the pain is still there, but quieter. I folded the letter neatly and placed it on my father's desk, right beside the brass nameplate that still read Owner. Then I walked through the shop one last time, tracing my fingers along the machines I'd maintained like old friends. The air smelled of steel and betrayal. I gathered a few things that truly mattered, my notebook of tool settings, a faded photo of Grandpa and me from my first day at the shop, and his welding gloves, stiff with age, but still fitting perfectly. He'd given them to me when I turned 18, saying, "These gloves build things that last. Don't ever hand them to someone who doesn't know how to use them." I slipped them into my bag. When I stepped outside, dawn was just beginning to break over the bay. The air was sharp, the sky streaked with gray and pale orange. For the first time in 10 years, I didn't have anywhere I needed to be. The parking lot was empty except for my old pickup, its hood dusted with frost. I climbed in, turned the key, and sat for a moment as the engine sputtered to life. My reflection in the windshield looked older than 32, eyes tired, face lined, a decade of exhaustion and disappointment carved into every feature. As I pulled out of the lot, I didn't look back. The shop lights glowed behind me, a distant hum fading into silence. My grandfather's gloves rested on the passenger seat. The leather worn smooth where his hands used to be. I placed mine over them, whispering under my breath, "I'm sorry, Grandpa." I tried. Then I drove away, leaving behind the building that had once felt like home, but now felt like a grave. For the first time, the road stretched open in front of me, cold, uncertain, but mine. 8 days passed. 8 long, quiet, disorienting days. The first few felt like I was detoxing from a life I didn't know had poisoned me. My body didn't understand what to do without the constant vibration of machines or the sharp tang of cutting fluid in the air. I'd wake up at 5 o'clock out of habit, sit up in bed, and feel that fleeting panic of being late. Then remember there was nowhere to be. I was crashing at my friend Melissa's small apartment above her bakery. She didn't ask questions, just left coffee on the counter and gave me space to breathe. For the first time in a decade, I could smell something other than metal. By the 8th day, I had almost stopped checking my phone. The silence from my parents was louder than any argument could have been. I told myself they wouldn't reach out, that they'd double down on their decision and prove me right. I was wrong. That afternoon, while I was helping Melissa carry flour bags in from the delivery truck, my phone buzzed. I didn't recognize the number at first, but my chest tightened anyway. I wiped my hands and answered, "Olivia." My father's voice cracked through the line before I could even respond. It wasn't the steady, commanding tone I grew up with, it was strained, uneven. "Thank God you picked up." I froze. "Dad, it's Steel Core Dynamics," he said, his words tumbling over each other. "They're threatening to pull their contract. Chad's been handling their last order, and apparently the specs are off. They said the parts don't match the tolerances you used to run. They won't sign off until someone fixes it." His breath hitched. "We can't afford to lose them. That's 40% of our revenue. You have to come back." For a second, my old instincts kicked in. I could almost see the machine in my head, hear the spindle whining wrong, feel the fix waiting in my fingertips. Every part of me wanted to grab my keys, drive straight to the shop, and set things right. That's what I'd always done. Clean up their messes. Make things work. But then I remembered that red envelope. I remembered the signatures. I remembered the look of my name on that employee list, buried beneath the man who took everything I'd built. I took a deep breath and said quietly, "I don't work there anymore." "Olivia." Dad snapped, his voice rising with panic. This isn't about that right now. We need you. Chad needs you. He's trying, but he doesn't understand the technical side. Then maybe he shouldn't be the owner of a machine shop, I cut in. My voice didn't shake this time. It came out calm, flat, final. There was a pause on the other end. I could hear him inhale like he was about to argue, then stop himself. For once, he had no quick fix, no authority to lean on. Please, he said after a long silence. We're drowning here. I stared out the window at the soft gray of late winter, the smell of yeast and cinnamon drifting from below. It struck me how different this air was, how clean it felt to breathe without oil and betrayal in it. You made your choice, I said softly. Let the owner handle it. The silence that followed was deafening. I could almost picture him standing in the office, surrounded by paperwork he didn't understand. Chad pacing beside him, trying to bluff his way through another disaster. When he didn't answer, I added, "Good luck, Dad." Then I hung up. For a moment, I just stood there, the phone still in my hand, my heart pounding so hard it hurt. Not from fear this time, but from something sharper, something that felt like power. I turned the phone face down on the counter and exhaled. Realizing my hands were shaking. Not because I was angry, but because for the first time in my life, I hadn't rushed back to fix things. I hadn't sacrificed myself for someone else's comfort. For 10 years, every boundary I'd had was blurred by obligation and guilt. But that one phone call, the plea in my father's voice, the quiet click of ending it, became the line I'd never cross again. I wasn't their safety net anymore. I wasn't their unpaid labor or their invisible heir. I was just Olivia. And for the first time in a decade, that felt like enough. It was a gray Sunday morning, the kind where the sky looks like brushed metal, and the air smells faintly of rain. I had stopped at Miller's Diner, a small place on the corner of Jefferson Avenue, the kind of spot that still served coffee in chipped mugs and played soft country music through an old radio. I sat in my usual booth by the window, eating scrambled eggs and toast, trying to convince myself that this was what peace looked like, quiet, unremarkable, ordinary. Then I saw them. At first, I thought my eyes were playing tricks on me. But when the door swung open and the bell above it chimed, I froze mid-bite. My parents walked in, followed closely by Claire and Chad. My father's face was red, his jaw tight. My mother looked nervous, her hands clutched around her purse strap. Claire had that look she always wore when she wanted to appear composed but was barely holding it together. And Chad, of course, stood behind them, perfectly pressed shirt, that smug little half-smile, like he was walking into a board meeting. He thought he'd already won. They spotted me immediately. My mother hesitated, whispering something to my father, but he ignored her and marched straight toward my table. The diner went quiet. Forks paused mid-air. Conversations faded into the low hum of the fluorescent lights. "Olivia," my father said, standing over me, his voice heavy with authority. "We need to talk." I didn't look up right away. I finished chewing, swallowed, and calmly set my fork down. "About what?" His voice rose. "About this childish behavior. About what you've done. The family needs you." I looked at him, genuinely confused. The family, or the business? He blinked, not expecting the question. "They're the same thing," he said firmly. "Are they?" I asked, leaning back in the booth. "Because it didn't feel that way when you signed everything over to your son-in-law. Don't make this bigger than it is. You're blowing things out of proportion. Chad just wanted to help." I laughed. A short, humorless sound. "Help? He owns it, Claire. You call that helping?" Chad finally spoke, sliding his hands into his pockets like he'd been waiting for his cue. "No one's saying you didn't contribute, Olivia, but no one is